What's so funny? Huh? What's so fun? He's talking about what?
Supermodels. I'm watching the live. I'm trying to watch the live stream.
Can you hear this conversation on the live stream? Because that means then the mic's working. That's all we're doing. Okay, should we get started? Bismillah. Bismillah walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. So we haven't had this halakha in like a month and a half. A month, maybe. We've been looking at the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi. Next week, we're going to reset all of our classes. We'll still continue with this. But we'll have a bigger advertising push. We're going to add some other classes in the coming week, inshallah. But we'll continue with this. And then I think on Mondays after this, we'll add a second class. If you're here in the summer, we're doing something that was just on like foundations of religion. I was going through like the fiqh of prayer, according to the Hanafi school. So probably do something similar for our convert community. People just trying to rebuild a relationship with their Islam who were born into it. But that'll be next week. And we'll still continue with this. But then after, probably have a class. So just look out for it. So we're on hadith number 6. If people want to really quickly just pull it up on your phone. If you Google something like 40 hadith Nawawi 6, it'll pop up. This is a hadith that's on the heart. It talks about matters of halal and haram. It's narrated by a companion by the name of Nu'man ibn Bashir, who we'll talk about in a bit. But if you're looking for the hadith, once somebody has it, it'd be great if they could read it also. Does anybody have it in front of them? Yeah. Yeah. Great. Can you read it?
The halal is clear and the haram is clear, and between them are matters unclear that are unknown to most people. Whoever is wary of these unclear matters has absolved his religion and honor, and whoever indulges in them has indulged in the haram. It is like a shepherd who herds his sheep too close to preserve sanctuary, and they will eventually graze in it. Every king has a sanctuary, and the sanctuary of Allah is what he has made haram. There lies within the body a piece of flesh. If it is sound, the whole body is sound, and if it is corrupted, the whole body is corrupted. Verily, this piece is hard.
Great. Does anybody want to read the Arabic? Or can somebody read the Arabic? Hafi, are you trying to hide right now? Are you trying to shrink? We're not. This isn't I'm not going to call on you to. Yeah. Hadith number 6, the Arabic. Somebody read it. Yeah, go for it.
عن أبي عبد الله النعمان بن بشير رضي الله عنهما قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول إن الحلال بين وإن الحرام بين وبينهما أمور مشتبهات لا يعلمهن كثير من الناس فمن اتقى الشبهات فقد استبرأ لدينه وعرضه ومن وقع في الشبهات وقع في الحرام كالراعي يرعى حول الماء يشق أن يرتع فيه ألا وإن لكل ملك حمأ ألا وإن حمى الله محرمه ألا وإن في الجسد مضغة وإذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله وإذا فسدت فسد الجسد كله ألا وهي القلب.
Jazakallah khair. So, just like we were looking at the previous hadith, you want to try to memorize these hadith or parts of the hadith as best as you can. There's a barakah in like just learning the hadith, but also when you're actually narrating hadith, it's important to just know the wording that the Prophet ﷺ is conveying it to us through. There's nuance that gets lost sometimes in meaning. So the companion who's narrating this hadith, his name is Nu'man ibn Bashir. And when we looked at the previous 5 hadith, they were narrated by Umar ibn al-Khattab, Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and Aisha bint Abi Bakr. We talked about the 4 of them, gave a little bit of biographical information about them, gave some insight on who they were, and kind of the placement of the hadith. So Nu'man ibn Bashir as a companion is interesting because both of his parents were also companions. And essentially what happens is when the Muslims leave from Mecca to go to Medina, there's things that are said about them that claim that they've been cursed as a population. There's no children that are going to be born. And for quite some time in Medina, there's actually no children that are born. And some of the companions get into a state of disarray, wondering as if these words that are being applied to them are actually valid in some capacity. There's 2 groupings of individuals that we're taught about when we're looking at the companions more broadly, right? So just as a recap, like somebody's considered to be a Sahaba, a companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him, if they both met the Prophet in their lifetime and passed away in a state of faith, right, in a state of Iman. So for example, Abu Lahab, who would have met the Prophet, wouldn't be considered a companion because he didn't die as a Muslim. Does it make sense? Right? And then if you were to subdivide that grouping of companions into categories, there's different ways that the Prophet describes these individuals, people we can look at in a variety of ways. The Ashara Mubashara, the 10 who are guaranteed paradise, right? The Khulafa Rashidun, the 4 rightly guided caliphs, etc. But 2 generic groupings of companions are people who are called the Muhajirun, the ones who made Hijrah, meaning they migrated from Mecca to Medina, which is a second migration, right? It's important for us to understand this because the first migration that takes place is from Mecca to Abyssinia, right? A group of people go from Mecca to Abyssinia. They find sanctuary in the Christian king, the Najashi. Abyssinia is modern-day Ethiopia, and that's an entirely important conversation that one should have, but really remarkable, and to think out what that must mean. If you've been coming to the Sira classes we do on Wednesday, you talk about elements societally of race and class and how that impacts Meccan society, that this group of Meccan Muslims and then this group of Meccan mushrikeen, these non-Muslims who follow them, are now in this kingdom that is both presided over as well as the majority are people who are black. And it's quite distinct from the society in which they're coming from. But this hijrah that we're talking about, this migration that the Muhajirun are associated with, is when they leave from Mecca to go to Medina to establish the city of Medina. The people who welcome them in, they're called the Ansar, the helpers. Right? So here's the 2 categories in this conversation. We're looking at Muhajirun and Ansar. Nu'man ibn Bashir is from the Ansar. He's from a tribe called the Khazraj tribe. And he's a child that is born amongst the first children born in Medina. So after some time when no one has been born and people are getting distraught, there is a companion by the name of Abdullah ibn Zubair, who is the grandson of Abu Bakr, who is born in Medina. And the people are so elated at the birth of this young child, They say Abu Bakr like holds him upon his shoulders and walks through the streets. He's the first child born in a long time. Nu'man ibn Bashir is born to the Ansar 6 months later, right? So he's one of the first children. Why is this something that's important to understand? Any thoughts? If he's born in Medina, and he's born now like some time after the Hijrah takes place, what can we also like understand about him? Yeah.
One of the first children born into Muslim society.
Yeah. But as a person who's like telling us this hadith now, do you know what I mean? What do we then know by virtue of who he is in just relation to his birth, the timing of his birth? Huh?
He's a child.
He's a kid, right? Because how long were people in Medina after they migrated from Mecca before the Prophet passes away? 10 years, yeah? So if the Prophet is in Medina for 10 years and this companion is narrating on behalf of what he's heard from the Prophet, then he's going to be narrating this at a young age. And if he's a baby at the early part of Medina, then we can also understand the placement of this hadith is coming at a time where he's going to be old enough to discern like language, right? Because if you ever met a baby, as smart as the babies are that you've met, they're not going to be speaking and narrating hadith, let alone like saying anything. Do you know? They have to get to a certain place where their faculties and capacities are capable of being able to do this. So you can contextualize now that this statement has to have been heard by this person at a time that is in this stage. Nu'man ibn Bashir doesn't narrate like thousands of hadith. The number of hadith that are attributed to him are probably like in 100 and some change. And quite often the hadith that he's narrating are hadith that are done through a companion, like another link between him and the Prophet because of the age that he has. But here is a hadith that Nu'man ibn Bashir is narrating just through himself directly. There's a lot that we can derive from this, but fundamentally as a child, he's still now invested within, or embedded rather, within this broader system of proliferation of hadith. And he's giving us this insight now in a Medinese period of hadith, right? That the Prophet is still talking about these things, but they're going to be relevant to Medina because in Mecca, the Quranic verses that are being revealed are not necessarily about the legality of situations, right? Because how are they going to pray when people are persecuting them? How are they going to establish like fasting and charity when people are literally boycotting them? We talked about Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who was the narrator of the hadith, like 2 hadith prior to this, where he talks about embryology and the kind of qadr. Do people remember what I'm talking about? Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he was a black Sahaba, right? There's narrations that talk about his hair being in braids. He was the first companion to recite Quran publicly. He was beaten and abused as a result of this. You know, there's so much that we discussed about who he is, radiallahu an, and the influence he has on the development of Islam in Kufa, and in turn the Hanafi school, and so much more. Nu'man ibn Bashir is growing up in a different setting. He's not in a place where that's what his reality is growing up with his Islam. He's also unique because he's born to 2 companions. So you're seeing at his birth the advent now of something that's interesting, that is generational Islam. Because more or less all of the people that were coming prior to a lot of this were people who converted into the religion. But growth of a community can be rooted sociologically in the sustaining of identity through generations. You see? It didn't stop with his parents' generation, but he's born into it, and he's one of the first children born in the Medinan period of the prophetic experience. There's a lot that they talk about Nu'man ibn Bashir radiallahu anh in terms of who he was as a young person, but he's a child, you know? So you're not going to have narrations of Nu'man ibn Bashir like fighting at Badr and Uhud and these places. He's a baby, right? Do you know? And you want to think about these things because these are people who lived entire lives and they still have placement within historical context. There's a lot of different narrations that speak about Nu'man ibn Bashir, but the Prophet had a relationship with him as he did with other children, and he loved children and he engaged them in these ways. So there's one narration, for example, that the Prophet ﷺ gives like 2 bunches of grapes to Nu'man ibn Bashir, and he says, have one for yourself and give one to your mother. And then Nu'man radiallahu anh takes the grapes and he eats his, and then as he's going to his mom, like he eats that one too. And the Prophet said, like, what happened with the grapes? And he says to him, you know, a messenger of God, like, I ate the grapes, right? And the Hadith says the Prophet like pulls on his ear, but he's essentially in an endearing way, like saying to him, you know, you're like a little rascal, like what's wrong with you, right? But that was the kind of relationship that they had with each other. Do you know? He's a child, and this hadith we can break into essentially 3 different kind of settings of information. The first part, the Prophet is talking about the halal is clear and the haram is clear. But you want to juxtapose your understanding of halal and haram to this boy's understanding of halal and haram. Because the way that it's been conveyed to him is not just now about the outward, because the last part of the hadith, ala wa inna fil jasadi mudghatan, right, that indeed in your body there's a morsel of flesh. He talks about the heart. He's being introduced to the concept of halal and haram holistically. Not just don't do this, don't do that, this is bad, that's wrong, you're haram, everything you do is terrible. But as a child, he's been given an insight into religion that conveys this now from the standpoint of how that which is outward and external relates to that which is inward. And then the middle chunk of this is relating to now this amazing kind of metaphor that the Prophet does illustrate in terms of giving an insight into like how one should be relating to this concept of the halal and the haram. And there's a lot to extrapolate from that. Nu'man ibn Bashir was also known as somebody who was a great orator. His communication skills were really remarkable. But you think about it from a socialization standpoint, if as a child he is narrating hadith from the Prophet, that means he's spending time with the Prophet of God. And the Prophet is an amazing communicator, right? His speech is remarkable. And so no one in the hadith can find anybody that says, I spoke to Muhammad and I didn't understand what he was talking about. There's no hadith that you read where somebody walks away saying, he didn't get me and where I was coming from. Do you see? And so this young boy now is in Medina. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is reciting Quran in front of the Kaaba publicly and people are beating him. In a controlled environment where you have the establishment of a city that is Medina, you're now able to benefit within a space of stillness from the teachings in ways that are different. And so the qualities that are being passed on also from a good teacher is the ability to effectively kind of take from your positive traits. So these young people who are in the Prophet's company, they're going to also pick up on his oration skills and his communication skills and his ability to be very effective in the way that he disseminates like knowledge. Does that make sense? He's known as being like a good poet, right? That his words are really remarkable, mashallah. And there's other stuff that goes into it. But you want to think about this from the standpoint of those different frames, but being able to understand then, as a boy, if he's hearing this, it's got to be at a place where it's in Medina, And the Prophet is like speaking about these things still in the city of Medina. After they've established their city, they have their community, there's growth, and he's telling these people these things. Your heart is what is your guiding compass. There's these boundaries that you don't want to transgress. And there's a connection point between the outward and the inward. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So if we start from the beginning, right, where the hadith is giving us these like really remarkable kind of phrases, such depth, in al-halal bayin wa in al-haram bayin, that indeed the permissible is unambiguous. Right? That's what it means by clarity. There's no ambiguity to it. You can't like say, maybe it means this, maybe it means that. The permissible means this, and the impermissible means maybe that. No, bayin means clarity in the sense that there's no ambiguity to it. Do you know? Like if I said to you, give me the iPad, all of you know definitively what I'm talking about, right? If I said to you, like, hand me the microphone, everyone knows. There's no ambiguity to it. If I said to you, like, write down what love means, all of you would probably write something different from somebody else, right? It doesn't mean that what you're saying is wrong, but it doesn't have the same concreteness to it, right? What does, like, goodness mean? Write it down. You'd also still have some distinct perspectives to it. This hadith is saying there's no ambiguity. The halal is clear and the haram is clear. So what I'd like you to do, before we jump into it, is turn to the persons next to you. More people have trickled in. Introduce yourselves, right? Share some names. What do these two words mean? Halal and haram. And when were you first exposed to them? Does it make sense, the question? Right? And with an understanding that if you're new to like some of the halakas that I do, your job is to not like correct somebody or remedy someone. You're not supposed to speak only when you have the most correct thing to say, but we have to benefit from everybody's perspectives. Don't keep yourself from talking because you're worried about saying the wrong thing, right? There's no wrong answer. When was the first time you can remember hearing the word haram and halal? And what do these words mean to you, right? And then we'll come back and discuss. You want to get comfortable to a place where you can reflect on religion. You can develop a connection to it through like a thoughtful process. Does that make sense? Right? This hadith is important. There's so many people who are collectors of hadith. One of the major books of hadith within Sunni Islam, the Sunan of Abu Dawood, Imam Abu Dawood, he cites this hadith as one of 4 hadith that if you know any hadith, like if you know these 4 hadith, then that's all you need to know Islam. This is one of those hadith. Right? There's other companions, there's other scholars. Mullah Ali Qari, rahimahullah, he cites it as one of 3 hadith that you would need to know, right? Just foundational hadith that everything builds upon. So it's an important hadith, right? So we want to understand these concepts, but we want to benefit from each other's insights also. Because you can just memorize something, but to build a relationship with it, there has to be that intimacy. Do you get what I mean? And we also want to benefit from each other and kind of being in each other's company and building our relationships and bonds on things that are a little deeper than this. So we all know this verse, Ya ayyuhan nas inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila li ta'arafu, that, oh, mankind, we made you from a male and a female into nations and tribes so that you know one another, right? Li ta'arafu is the objective. That's like the point of it, so that you know one another, and it's an intimate knowing, right? It's not ilm, which is just concrete information knowledge, 2 + 2 = 4, I know this, or it's not fahm, that I can comprehend that 2 + 2 = 4. Ta'aruf is an intimate knowledge. That's the whole point of being made into diverse groupings of people. The objective is outlined in the verse. It's not a product, it's the objective. The point is, when you come together in diverse groupings, that you want to build that intimate knowing of one another. How are you going to do that if you don't talk to each other? right? Or you come and you hear one person just talk at you all the time. So there's residual benefit from sharing your ideas and thoughts. We become more acquainted with each other. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay, so just turn to the person's next to you, ideally in pairs. Like, try not to do more than 3 so everybody gets to talk. Somebody's sitting around you and they, like, have no one talking to them, invite them in to talk with you. Like, what do these 2 terms mean, halal and haram? And when were you first introduced to them? And then we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead. Okay, so what do these words mean? Because we hear them a lot, right? What does it mean? What does the word halal mean? Yeah, but what does that mean? Yeah.
You can do it without any religious harm to yourself.
Okay, great. Do you see the difference between this, the word permissible, and you can do it without any religious harm to yourself? If we were to build upon that, what else would it mean then?
Just harm to yourself.
Yeah, but what if I didn't do it?
That would be fine too.
That would be fine too, right? This is the difference between the word halal and fard, right? Because the fard is also permissible, but if you don't do it, then it has the potential that there can be punishment as a result. But the permissible, merely permissible, doesn't mean that. Does that make sense? What about haram? What does the word mean? Don't say impermissible.
Like if you do it, you are committing harm. I am committing harm to myself if I do something that's haram.
Yeah, it can be a grounds for punishment. What makes something permissible?
That it's not haram.
It's kind of like default. It's not everything else that it's.
Yeah, but how do you know?
God tells you.
Okay. And how do you know something is not permissible?
Same thing. You're also told.
Great. So it's not like fully applicable, right? Now, if we start to break this down categorically, there's two types of categories that these things can be broken into. There's what's called the ibadat, the matters of worship, and the mu'amalat, like the more non-worship oriented, let's just call it that. So worship and everything else. In this category that is worship oriented, in order for something to be permissible, there has to be an evidence that permits it. In this category that's not worship, everything by default is permitted unless there's evidence that says it's not permitted. Do you see the difference? Does it make sense? So, I can't tell you that one of the ways we worship Allah is by sitting in gray chairs at 6:35 p.m. on Monday nights and pray 2 rak'ahs sitting down. This is now like a form of prayer that we have. I'd have to have a basis to be able to make that claim. You see what I mean? This point is important to understand because in Imam Nawawi's Hadith, we're on Hadith number 6, and I'm going to try to go through them much quicker. I know we've been going through them like a little slower, but you want to like engage it so that you can actualize it. There's no point in just engaging it so that you know it. Like, that's the bridge between knowledge and wisdom. You act upon what you know, right? May Allah make us people of wisdom. So here, you're in a place where the hadith prior to this, from Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, is the hadith that talks about, like, matters of innovation. You know? He who adds something to this faith of ours that is not from it, it'll be rejected. Right? You remember those of you who were here a month and a half ago, last time we talked? Anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah, great. Okay. So I can't say, like, just because this is how we are going to now engage in matters of worship. And worship is not just prayer and fasting and charity and pilgrimage. It's all of those things, right? Dua, supplication, etc. There's got to be a basis to it. And on the other end of it, there has to be a basis that says this is why something is not permitted. The hadith gives us an insight that we can all understand with ease. For example, marriage is permitted in Islam, right? The halal is clear. Fornication is not permitted in Islam, right? The haram is clear. I can give you a gift in Islam, right? It's permitted, right? You can give me gifts whenever you want to. It's permitted. I can't steal something from you. That's not permissible. These are things that have clarity to them, and we know it. Do you get what I mean? And that's where a lot of the Quran and the Hadith give us insight. It just says things straight up. Pork, can't eat it. You know? Don't eat pork. That just means don't eat pork. So there's not really like room around it. So somebody says, why can you not eat pork? Well, it's one of those things. You can eat 1,000 different things, but don't eat that. Don't eat the carcass of an animal. Don't eat something that has had other than the name of the divine uttered over it, right? The verse has a lot of different facets to it, but it's carving out now from what the normative understanding of consumption is, the exceptions. So for in that act that is not worship oriented, for you to understand what is not permissible, there has to be a basis to it. You see? It doesn't come just out of nowhere. As you grow in your relationship with this religion, you don't understand it as a sociological identity variable, that I'm just born into it and I inherit it, or it's a title that I have, but it's a way of life. So what we have as essentially categorization of acts that we can bear manifest through our sheer will and determination, every single thing you do can fit into a box. It has what's called a hukm to it, right? And there's what's called the ahkam shari'ah. If I had a whiteboard behind me, I would write it. But just picture in your head, you know? So you have at the ends, like what is obligatory, the fard, and what is haram, impermissible. In the middle, you have what is called mubah, or just neutral. And then between what is obligatory and neutral, you have what's called mustahab, or kind of recommended. And then you can have another category that is sunnah, that is like a prophetically practiced, like recommended act. And then between neutral and haram, you have what's called makruh, or what's disliked. Are you okay? Yeah. Did I say something to upset you? I'm sorry. Yeah. Ideally, when you get to a place where you understand how you relate to Sharia, you know the hukam of what you're going to do before you do it. So after you start working is not the ideal time to think, is this something that's permissible for me to do? Do you get what I mean? When you're like immersed in it, yeah, like you should still do it had you not done it before. But the goal is to not know all of it across the board, but how does it apply to me, ideally before I exert decision making on it. So what is the ruling on this thing before I actually do it? Does that make sense? How do I familiarize myself with it? And where the halal is clear and the haram is clear, and you start seeing these hadith connect to each other, there's not really like room to suddenly maneuver around it in ways that is not within our authority. The challenge that comes in is that we have sometimes tenuous relationships with some of these terminologies. Because if you think about this spectrum in your mind that we just put out there, haram, and then all the rest of this stuff, technically, all the rest of this stuff can fit in the realm now of what is halal. Does that make sense? So there's a lot that goes into permissibility in comparison to the sliver that is impermissible. But if you don't have a relationship with terminology and you don't build foundational understanding, it doesn't need for you to know it in order for it to still be categorized in the ways that it is. But quite often what ends up happening is that we build a jaded relationship with faith because people tell us things are haram that are not haram. And then the things that are actually haram, we try to intellectualize in a way that doesn't necessarily fall within the parameters of religion. Islam doesn't function off of prisms of just rational and irrational. Something makes sense to me, or something does not make sense to me. There's a third frame that interjects itself that is supra-rational. It doesn't need for me to understand it in order for it to be true. A God-centric religion like Islam is based off of the assumption that there's certain things that God will ask you to do that you love to do, certain things that God asks you to do that you will struggle with, and certain things that God asks you to do that you don't really understand why this thing is what it is, but you still yield to the idea that Allah knows best. Does that make sense? And so the halal is clear and the haram is clear. It's not because my grandma told me that this isn't allowed or that's not allowed. And then you use language that supposes these terms, but in ways that are just throwing people off track. So somebody sits you down and says, tell me about this Islam thing. An Islam thing, you're supposed to X, Y, or Z. But the word supposed to is in a problematic way alluding to this is an obligation. Do you know? Or you're not supposed to do this, right? Does that make sense? It's better to do this than assumes that the other alternative must be worse. But that's just not like things. Do you get what I mean? I went to a conference when it's probably like in my late 20s, an MSA conference, college students, and I'd given a talk like at a session in a lecture hall at this university that we were at, I think in Philadelphia, and then there was some kids there from North Carolina, and one came up to me and said, can you talk to some of us after the session's done? I said, okay. And everybody exited the lecture hall, and then 30 people walked in from this college, and they were in the seats, they were looking at me, and I was looking at them, and I said, what are we doing here, guys? And they said, just tell us something. And I said, what? What does that even mean? You know? And they were like, tell us about like something that we should know. There's not a lot of speakers that come to our campus. We just want to take advantage of this time. So I said, I don't really know, what you want me to talk to you about. And they said, how do we deal with like things that our friends aren't supposed to do? Talk to us about like gender interaction and listening to music and this kind of stuff. And my head was like, man, I don't want to talk to you about this, right? Like, what? But you'd want to think, why does this person's mind automatically go to that's what Islam is? Right? So I said, well, tell me about your college. And they kind of doubled down on that. And this girl was talking to me and she said, like boys and girls, they're not supposed to talk to each other. And I said, I'm a boy. And she said, what do you mean? And I was like, well, you're a girl, right? And I said, is this haram? And she said, I don't know. And I said, what does the word haram mean? And then someone said, something is haram if it hurts you. And I said, if somebody called me on the phone right now and said, my dad went to the hospital and it hurt me, did they do something haram? Your religion will be taken away from you if you don't actually educate yourself on what the foundational parts to it are. And if at this stage in your Islam, regardless of how many weeks, months, or years you've been Muslim, what you've been given is just what somebody else possesses that doesn't have an understanding of like the linguistic and technical aspects, all you gotta do is learn it once. Then you're depriving yourself of the breadth of beauty that can come from this religion and the opportunity to really delve into an idea that through this have I conceptualized a divine entity that's an angry old man in the sky looking for a reason to punish me, or do I believe in a God that believes in me more than I believe in myself and has set these parameters for me for my benefit, not as something to suffocate me? Another time I went to my parents' home. My dad, when he wasn't sick, he used to do a halakha for some of his friends and other families in my parents' home. And they were talking about something relevant to zakat. And I was visiting and they said, can you say something? And I don't remember how the conversation landed where it was, but we started to talk about Surah Al-Mu'minun. And one of the verses in Surah Al-Mu'minun, it says, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ, like the doers of zakah are the ones who are successful. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, the believers have succeeded, says the initial verse. And then the characteristics that define it, one of the characteristics says, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ, the ones who do zakat. So I started talking about like tazkiyah and zakat in that sense and whatever else. And then when it wrapped up, there was a older auntie that was there. She was older than me, at least at that time. Her son was there. And her son is like in this awkward phase. He's 12, 13 years old, but he's like 5'10", still trying to grow into his body. He's got like these little hairs above his lip, and the kid is 5'10". I am not 5'10". Do you know what I mean? But he's looking at me like from like the corner of his eyes as he's trying to just hunch over as if he wants to disappear into himself. And his mother said, you know, it's so nice for you to come and talk to us and this and that. But what would have been great is if you talked about this other verse that says, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ, that from the characteristics of the believers are the ones who avoid what is laghu, like what is futile. There's no benefit to it. And she said, my son, he just plays video games all day. He sits in front of the television and he plays these games and it's laghu. Can you tell him it's haram? And I said, you know, Auntie, I'm sorry, but like I can't tell him it's haram. And then the kid like straightened up a little bit more, you know, and like looked at me. And I said, the word haram means something very specific. And I don't have a basis of being able to tell him that this is haram. He's just playing a game that's like virtual, do you know? If the content of the game is haram, that's a different question. But he's not. He's just playing like a video game. Do you know what I mean? She couldn't grasp this idea very well initially, you know? She was like, no, but just tell him it's haram, right? And I was like, no, like, that's not something I can do, right? That kid exists within millions of Muslim people who growing up had adults who didn't know what else to say, and they said, if you do this, God will hate you. If you do this, you're going to hell. If you do this, you're going to be punished. Or, in the context of what we're talking about, this is haram. I once had an uncle who told me that eating baked ziti is haram. And I'm a little kid, and I'm like, what? I like eating pasta. Do you know? And he's like, we don't eat these pasta things. This is haram, right? But the loose application of this is what the entirety of the hadith prior to is evoking. Hadith number 5. You add something to this religion that's not a part of it, it's rejected. It's just not a part of it. And when we break it down in matters of worship, you need an evidence as to why it's done. And these non-worship matters, the mu'amalat, you need an evidence to say why it cannot be done. So the one thing that's impermissible is in a sea of a million things that is permissible. Do you get what I mean? You can't drink this one thing, but there's thousands of things that you can drink. You can't eat this thing, but there's thousands of things that you can eat. Allah does not render something impermissible within the frame of the mundane, the non-sacred and non-worship. The way, like none of you is wearing the same outfit, right? Why? Because there's so much more that's expansive in permissibility. You can literally wear every single one of the things you're wearing, and likely, if we walk through all of these buildings in their entirety, every floor, you won't run into any person that's dressed exactly the same as you. Do you get what I mean? So you can't make something restrictive that's purposely meant to be expansive, right? And you understand like these two things as benchmarks, but recognizing that this is like a part of our religion. It's not for me and you to suddenly say what's halal is not and what's haram is not. And it's not based off of I feel, I think, I want. It's definitely not rooted in kind of supremacist ideology that makes us self-loathing and self-deprecating and tells us that we need to be other than what we are. No, you have a pride in your Islam, and you find a sense of comfort and empowerment through it. It's going to be hard to digest these words if you've never thought who Allah is to you. Because the lawmaker and the lawgiver is the same. That's Allah. And in the back of your head, if you just see your Sunday school teacher, or the guy who has anger issues on the pulpit, or like parents who have generational trauma and they're putting all this stuff, or like the person who thinks they're like the most knowledgeable Muslim and whatever experience of Islam that you're in, that makes it devoid of a sense of understanding, of compassion and recognition of so much more, yeah, then like you're gonna be where you're at right now with it. Do you know? And we can delve into this in a lot of different ways, but it's important to understand that like all of us in this room likely are doing things that are haram. That doesn't mean we become indifferent towards it, but that means we also all have things that we can improve upon. And if you're in a place where religion suddenly coincides with everything that you do exactly, then you're probably not practicing religion in a way where you're subservient to Allah, but you've made Allah subservient to you. It's not possible fundamentally that someone isn't making a mistake in some capacity, right? The amount of dumb stuff people lie about. Do you know what I mean? It's so crazy what people lie about. You can see just how many people lie in the world around you right now, right? And the kind of things that they lie about. And they have no qualms about lying about anything. Do you know what I mean? These things have to be rooted primarily in theology. Because if there's not faith and belief and conviction, and it's just in a vacuum, sociologically, then at some level you're going to say, I'm not of this cultural background. Why do I have to do it this way? But you're not thinking about it from a religious experience standpoint. Do you see what I mean? Right? When the Prophet dealt with people who struggled with haram, he walked with them through it. He didn't condescend them, other than when the haram they engaged in was hurting other people. So there's companions who would come to the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, I kissed someone I wasn't supposed to. Ya Rasulullah, I drank alcohol. There's a Sahaba who comes to the Prophet, who I think we've talked about either in this class or different class, where in Ramadan, he is physically intimate with his wife. They end up having like a sexual experience. And he comes in and he's like, Messenger of God, I'm done. Like basically saying, I'm ruined. Like there's nothing that can be done for me. Do you know? The Prophet keeps telling him to do different things, right? Set this, like emancipate this person, give this much sadaqah, this and that. And every single thing, you know, the Prophet, I don't have charity to give. The Prophet tells him to fast like 60 days. He said, Ya Rasulullah, I couldn't fast one day. You think I'm going to fast 2 months straight? You know? It's a real interaction. Do you get what I mean? They're having a real experience. Somebody comes then with a thing of dates, and the Prophet says, where's so-and-so and such and such? And such a beautiful part of the Hadith, you don't quite often see the people who have some of these struggles named. Right? The Prophet says, where's such and such a person? He comes and he gives him the dates, and he says, just go distribute this to the people who need it. And the man who committed the sin, he did the haram, he says, Ya Rasulullah, nobody's in more need than me and my family. And your Prophet then like smiles and laughs, and he says to him, just go and keep it yourself. Do you get what I mean? That's how he walked with people who struggled with haram. Other than when people were being racist, oppressive, or abusive, there was no words minced. The opposite is what happens these days. You get people in your face about these things that there should be compassion about, and when you know somebody is abusing a woman in their life, you turn the other cheek in a way that just creates cyclical problems. You see what I mean? And the prophetic mode of engagement was in the other direction. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? You want to start to build that relationship with yourself and shift paradigms through what these terms are. It's not just something that is kind of conjecture, it's fact. There's a lot more that's permissible than what is impermissible. And in the realm of what is obligatory in the form of worship, there's actually not so much that goes into it. And then you start to apply it and you think from the spiritual standpoint, and that's what the rest of this hadith is going to bring us into. So that which is lawful is clear, and that which is unlawful is clear. and between the two of them are doubtful or ambiguous matters about which not many people are knowledgeable. So they're making now a distinction, the hadith, between people of knowledge and people who are not people of knowledge. Does it mean that somebody's at fault if they don't know? No, but it's giving an indication not to stratify society, but people know certain things that other people do not know those things. So if you don't know, it's better not to give into a matter that is doubtful. How do these things start to apply? Well, there's a fundamental principle that you give in to certitude more than you give in to doubt. What you know is what's clear, and what is not clear, don't let that be the case. So for example, like, you don't know if you lost your wudu. Problem that many people will experience at some point or another in their life. The legal maxim that is derived from this is that certainty is not lifted by doubt. So you're taught that if you know that you made your wudu and you don't know if the wudu broke, then you continue as if you still have wudu. Does that make sense? It applies in the other direction on matters of doubt also. You come upon some food, right? We can use meat, for example, and we don't know the method through which this meat was slaughtered. Was it a Muslim butcher? Was it a Christian butcher? Was it an atheistic butcher? Was it somebody who's like a devil worshiper who slaughtered this thing? You don't know. So in that instance, the same principle applies, but because you know for certain that you don't know who did this, the default isn't to assume that it must be permissible. The default is that based off of what you know, that you don't give in to the matter of the doubt, which is we don't know who actually slaughtered this thing. Do you see what I mean? The doubtful matters can also engage in what are the makruh actions, that there's not clear defined like evidence that renders it haram as a category, because people didn't play around with these words. They weren't just arbitrarily saying, well, it must be haram or it must be fard. They were trying their best to draw rulings from what the divine was wanting us to do. And so someone would say, for example, like, it's makruh to talk while you make wudu, right? That's like one thing of something that has like kiraha to it. But like smoking, for example, some people say it's haram, some people say it's makruh. When we were in Egypt on our layover, or in Saudi, like during our Umrah, if you've ever gone to like any of these other countries, different from the United States, you see a box of cigarettes, and it's got like this little Surgeon's General warning here in the United States. When you go to these duty-free shops in other parts of the world, if this is like the cigarette box, this much of the box in big capital letters says something like, smoking will kill you. You know? Like, it's just huge. Do you know what I mean? Right? The more cautious thing would say, let me abandon that which has potential dislike to it. Because I don't know. Because I don't know, I'm going to leave behind what it is that I don't know. Or if you have like two opinions on something, one that says this is permissible and one that says it's impermissible, someone would at face value say, well, it's permissible, maybe I should just then be able to do it, which is fine. Like, that's not a problem. You should. But to just illustrate what we're talking about here, you would have the argument made that because there's different opinions on it, and one of the opinions says that this is something that's either impermissible or disliked, that it would be better to, out of caution, not engage in it, because there's thousands of things that are permissible, and there's just a handful of things that are impermissible. So if Sheikh so-and-so says, like, the job is good, right? But there's others who say, don't be engaging in that kind of stuff. then you try your best to be in a place that says, let me leave behind the things that are doubtful. Does that make sense? Right? And so when the Prophet says, thus he who avoids these doubtful matters certainly clears himself in regard to his religion and his honor, what does this have to do with honor? Because we can probably deduce what it has to do with deen, right? But how does honor factor into this? Does the question make sense? So if you turn to the persons next to you, if I am the person who does not stay away from the doubtful matters, how does that impact my honor? Because the Prophet is saying, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that whoever avoids doubtful matters, then in regards to their religion and their honor, they're clearing themselves. So where does honor come into this? How does that factor in as a variable? You can just turn to the persons next to you and talk about it, and then we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead.
Fulfills the idea of respect it's like even if it's like a slight doubt, right? It's like a slight doubt when someone's like it sort of ruins that person. Even the slightest doubt.
So we
Yeah, sort of like that.
yeah, like that. Because like, then you have the confidence that you are getting true.
And then the kid like, yeah, I want that shirt. It looks great. So they're like, oh, actually, I scroll like dog, this, and I just mixed it really thoroughly. You can't see it, but if I want to feel it, it's like this. Yeah. And then like, no one wants ice cream at that point. But I thought it was interesting idea. It'd be like a slight amount of yeah, it's very complimentary.
Okay, so what does this have to do with honor? What does it have to do with honor? Like, how does honor relate to this? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Like one idea is that the haram is, we want to avoid the haram to elevate like ourselves as Allah's creation, and in the gray areas, even if you have like a slight bit of haram in there, it's sort of like there's a doubt. There's like a doubt in someone's character, which you can't really perceive with a doubt in someone. You can't really be elevated if you have a doubt in your character.
Who will doubt your character?
The people you're dealing with, but also Allah.
Okay. Other thoughts? Any thoughts? Yeah.
When we were speaking about honor, we defined it as there's like another standard that you're holding yourself to. So something outside of just what's clear and what's unclear, but that metric of goodness within the gray zone.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Could be like the highest honor is getting into Jannah, and so that could be another definition of, or like the goal.
But this is like dignity, honor, right? So here now they're in Medina. Everybody's pretty much Muslim. And this is a young boy who is narrating this hadith to us. We already established this. If you act upon something that has this kind of public nature to it, you're creating an opportunity for people to now view you doing what it is that you're doing. Do you know what I mean? So if I taught this class, I gave Jummah, right? How many of you come here to Jummah, like on Fridays? Yeah, a lot of you. If I gave the khutbah in a pair of shorts and a tank top, right? You might be surprised. Do you know? But also after the fact, it might impact how it is that you understand me to be as a person. If you saw me do something haram, God forbid, right? If I cursed at my wife in front of you, may Allah protect us from this. Do you know? If you saw me spitting on the floor of the musalla, it's not haram as such, but why? Why would I do that? The religion in and of itself gives you a right to privacy. Umar radiallahu anh, he once sees somebody engaged in haram in their home, and he tells them you shouldn't do this, and the person says, why are you looking in my house? But you enter into the public sphere now. The relationship you have with the divine is uniquely your own, but you have accountability for what it is that sets precedent for those who see you doing certain things. One of my colleagues who was an Orthodox Jew, for example, he would eat at a restaurant I used to own down the street. In his dietary restrictions, he kind of changed up a bit for himself. And I sat down with him and I was like, how does this work in terms of your kind of religious law? And he said, it's fine. For me, I'm making my own decisions. But my father said to me that when you eat in these restaurants, it might be good for you to remove your yarmulke so that nobody who walks by and sees you like this thinks that they are also now permitted to eat in this place. Do you understand the concept that's being illustrated here? You can't look at it from the standpoint of a defensive mode of engagement. You just have to understand that your actions will set precedent. And it goes back to what we were saying before. All of these acts have a hukam to them. So if you don't know what the hukam is of the act you're engaged in before you're doing it, it still doesn't mean there's a hukam to it. So if somebody sees you in spaces where publicly you are engaged in the haram, that's one thing, versus you are now engaged in what is doubtful. It can create now this opportunity, which people should mind their own business, ideally. Just like we said, this hadith is one of 4 hadith that Imam Abu Dawood says that you got these 4 hadith, that's all you need. Another hadith that he mentions, he says, min husn al-Islam al-marri tarakahu ma la ya'nihi, that from the beauty of one's Islam is that he leaves behind that which does not concern him. It's not your business when somebody's going to have a baby or not. It's not your business if somebody is married or not. It's not your business somebody's got a job or not. Mind your business. But when you walk on the street and you are choosing to now engage in something in the public arena, you have a responsibility towards what's there. And what the Prophet ﷺ is saying is that you don't want somebody to start talking about you, and you're giving them a reason. So if I walk into this musalla and you all see me spit on the floor, can I get upset with you for then thinking that there's an aspect of honor lacking in my character? Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? You don't think so?
I guess it makes sense, but I wouldn't say that.
I mean, you're just a nice person. Yeah. But do you get what I'm saying? Right? So here, this is where this is at. And so you clear your honor because you've removed the doubtful matters from being in front of you. That I'm not in this place where I play a role in it. Nobody should be gossiping in the first place, but if you create the opportunity for some of it to come up, there's an argument to be made based off of like the intentionality of how it is that you're engaged in the act to begin with. And so that public-private nature of the act. We're blessed that we're in a community where the gross majority of people are like nice, non-judgmental people. There's some idiots here, right? Not in this room, but they are, you know, and we want to be mindful of that. And so there were still people during the time of the Prophet who had their struggles in a very public way. The Prophet affirmed them constantly. Abdullah radiallahu anh takes lashes, a had punishment for drinking alcohol publicly. People spoke poorly of him, the woad in which he drank. The Prophet would say to those people, do not assist shaitan in victory over your brother. Indeed, he loves Allah and his messenger. Right? That's the approach you want to take. So don't judge Khalid if he spits on the prayer floor. We don't know what's going on with him. Do you know what I mean? But the potential is there still nonetheless that it impacts like honor and dignity in a way, the way that you carry yourself in a public setting. You also have what can be advantageous or disadvantageous in a city that's filled with so many people that nobody's really paying attention to so much that we do to begin with anyway. But here, for example, you're thinking about a Medinese society, right? The Prophet gives his farewell khutbah to 120,000 people. It's not like 1 million people, let alone 100 million people. Do you know what I mean? So there's a lot more room now for certain things to kind of take place. What are also other things that have happened? If this is happening in the Medinese era, and this young boy is born into the Hijrah as one of the first children born in Medina, then you're going to have like the hypocrites who have spoken poorly of Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, the Hadith al-Ifk. You're going to have like these instances where people who are munafiqeen, they weren't there in Mecca, the munafiqeen, they're in Medina, right? There's all these other variables that are coming to play. The Prophet is telling his people, guard your honor. Like be in a place where you walk the way the Quran says, وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا, that the servants of the merciful are the ones who walk on the earth with dignity and honor and grace. Do you know what I mean? So you're in a place where you're recognizing and readying that for yourself. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? One of the interesting things about this hadith, yeah.
How would you define honor as people's assessment of your standing in society?
Honor, no. It could be an element of it, but your honor, as was said before, but having a different frame to it, is essentially like that sense of kind of presence that you're bringing within to any given environment whatsoever. Do you know what I mean? So what is it that could be undignified, you know? Like if you're the person that's constantly just like joking uproariously, you know, you're the person that demeans themselves like in a public sense or setting. Do you know what I mean? What is it that is bringing that? And these are sociologically like societies that function a little bit different than the way American society does. It's a very like individualized society. This culture is one that's rooted in principles of shame and honor. You know, these are tribalistic societies. So you're in a place where who you are represents bigger than just yourself. You represent an entire tribe, an entire clan, an entire community. There's like a sense of my name carries more meaning than just me. So how I carry myself, right? And these can be things that sway in different directions, you know? But this can only also be impactful when you understand, like other hadith, that validation is simply about the pursuit of divine validation. Because just because somebody likes you, that doesn't mean that Allah likes you for that reason. And just because somebody dislikes you, doesn't mean that Allah dislikes you because of that also. Do you know? So you could be in a place where the most honorable thing that you do is to get up from your office and pray your prayers, and people can mock you for it. Do you know what I mean? I got a meeting invite from people in senior leadership at the university for Friday, like around Jummah time. And this is important. We need this and that. I wrote back to them and I said, this is during our Friday prayers. Like, I'm not going to be able to make it. Do you know? They don't have to understand where I'm coming from. Do you get what I mean? Right? But my sense of self-dignity is rooted in this idea. The halal is clear and the haram is clear. Do you get what I'm saying? And that's where we also understand that, like, there's no beauty in doing the haram from the standpoint of what is understood as religious beauty. You know? You can't say that there's attractiveness to an act of disobedience. Do you get what I mean? And that becomes like a starting point, and then a second layer to it becomes now these doubtful matters as well. Do you get what I'm saying? And your body is wired for this. You don't want to think about it in a simplistic way. That's like, oh man, this guy is smoking this thing or listening to this thing, or he's dressed like this or she's dressed like that. Deepen your understanding of what the haram is, right? Like, how much does it hurt you when you hear people speaking poorly to people? It just stings in certain ways, you know? Some of you went for Umrah with us, and I talked to a bunch of you after the fact, and a lot of people said when they came back from Umrah for the first time here that it hurt so bad the first time they heard family members yelling at each other. Do you know what I mean? Like the first time they heard someone like being in a place where they were just speaking out of self-righteous anger as opposed to righteous anger. Do you know? It removes honor. It removes dignity. Do you get what I'm saying? And sometimes the most honorable thing you can do is go against what like the norms are also, right? So like you get up and you walk out of class when there's a walkout for Palestine. You know? Your family tells you, like, what will people think? What will people think cannot compare to what Allah will think. You see what I mean? Right? And so there's kind of some of those gradations to it. Does that make sense? Here, we live in societies that structure success around the amount of money that you have, like wealth you possess, materialistic things, and that becomes the base of honor, right? Or honor is rooted in, do I have a ring on my finger? Do I have babies? Do I have a house? Do you know what I mean? But that's not what Islamic honor is rooted in, you know? That's not what dignity is rooted in. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Yeah. Noor, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to ask what a culture that so closely guards honor, like how that relates to Islamic ideas and principles around justice when, like you said with the example of like cussing at a wife or in the cases of abuse, these things happen in private, but then in public people or cultures that really care about honor like to mask everything wrong that's happening in a community and like to present a certain way. I know that's an extremity, but it's also something that's common within Masajid and Muslim community and people with power.
Yeah.
In the Muslim community, so how do those two ideas relate?
Well, if you can think behind me, like if there was like a whiteboard, because there's a difference between shame and honor, right? And a lot of us live in cycles of shame. And the way cycles of shame break themselves are through empathy and love. Do you know? But a cycle of shame, for example, like how do people respond to shame? They might like just avoid it altogether. So if I borrowed your car, and when I borrowed your car, I got into an accident, and I then came back to your house, and I just walked upstairs and locked myself in the room. I'm like avoidant of it, do you know? Or I can like blame you for it. You're like, Khalid, what did you do to my car? And I was like, well, why'd you let me drive it, stupid? Right? Do you know? Like, there's modes through which we exist in these cycles of shame. And you can pass on generationally, like shame, which is a little bit different from honor, because an absence of honor doesn't necessarily denote haya, modesty, right? Haya has a specific definition. Haya is that Allah doesn't find you absent from a place that He would want you to be seen in, nor does He find you present in a place that He wouldn't want you to be in. Do you get what I mean? And that can be about the states that you present yourself in also, but just like the kind of gatherings, the, you know, the actual like purpose of communing, so to speak, right? When you get to a place now where like your own innate desire is at conflict with like what is shar'an, this is why decisions are either in one of two directions. It's either like what Allah wants you to do or what Hawa wants you to do, right? It's like shar'an or your desires, that's it. And so there's people who get to this place and they can make these claims, but they're overtly problematized. None of this makes sense if theology isn't the root of all of it. And the baseline theology in a Meccan period is both about a building of a relationship to monotheism as well as the building of a relationship to an afterlife. So that guy who in his house is an animal and outside of the house perceives himself to be like a saint, you know, his very limbs are going to still speak about what he did, as are the limbs that were witness to his transgressions. And this is like why God's dominion has to be understood and who God is to us, because we're going to stand in front of the divine. I remember the first time I met a man at a masjid that used to like pour water out to people as they broke their fast for iftars. And then during Tarawih prayers, he would also in Ramadan like just pass out water as people were listening to the sheikh give talks. And at a young age, like I found out that this man was also physically abusing his daughter. And later on, just so you know the kind of person I am, when I started doing what I do now and I started to learn how to help people, I helped that woman get out of a forced marriage. But at that age, I didn't know what was going on or what to do. But in my head, I'm trying to reconcile this question of like, this jerk does this in his house, but here he's doing this kind of outwardly. Do you know what I mean? This is a problem. Do you see what I'm saying? It's hard. You don't have to put the burden upon it on your shoulders. Quite often, most of us don't make decisions based off of what we believe in. We're not challenged in that way to stand on our own feet in terms of what our values are, what our ethics are. And then for many of us who are born into Muslim families, one of the dilemmas that we face usually surfaces in its initial state when we go head to head with like family members on different perspectives. It becomes overwhelming and inundating because I've never had to stand on my own feet in terms of what I believe in before, you know? And now as I'm doing that, I have to go head to head with somebody who's part of my family. It creates like that much more of a challenge. Do you know what I mean? It's not a religion that equates like difference or disagreement to disobedience. Do you know what I'm saying? But sometimes also the people that surround us, they're doing like things that are deeply un-Islamic. And we have to be able to, in our own capacity, create resources as best as we can. I was having dinner with some of my friends, and they were talking about some of their family members who were stuck in abusive situations. May Allah grant them ease. And one of my friends and I, as we were talking about it, and the others were like, it's so hard and it's so difficult, and she's got to stay in this situation because of financial reasons and this and that, and what can she do? I said, well, the problem isn't like she's making this decision to stay in that place. The problem is that the rest of us haven't built for her what she needs to be able to have the confidence that she can break out of that and still have communal support. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? And that's why like these elements of honor and dignity become important for us to recognize and understand that they play a central role in our religion. Because where is the sense of like respecting that woman's honor? And how do we dignify it to the extent that we take our resources and our talents and our wealth and build for her with honor, like an excellence, real ihsan, what she needs? Do you get what I'm saying? Right? And it's all attached together. You might not want to think about it this way, but you're not like here at Jummah as an obligation. You're not sitting like in a local masjid having iftar. You chose on a weeknight to give up your time to come and learn something. So the mode through which, for example, I roll out of bed at my leisure, throw some water on my face and in my pajamas, just bang out mindlessly 2 rak'ahs after the sun has risen for Fajr, or I don't even pray Fajr at all. It's all connected to each other. The metaphysical aspects of engaging in what is the fara'id and leaving behind the maharim become important to understand how then we are able to be vessels that carry out ourselves with dignity and grace. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Right? Okay. I want to be mindful of time because I'm going to try not to go on and on. One of the interesting things about this hadith, Imam Bukhari, who within the Sunni tradition of Islam, his Sahih is one of the major books of hadith that people rely heavily on. They study in traditional courses of study. He places this hadith, the halal is clear and the haram is clear, in a chapter that is called Kitab al-Buyu', meaning the book of transactions. And it's interesting that that's the chapter that he puts it in. Right? The one that tells you about how to engage in business dealings. How do you treat people across, in that type of relationship. Do you know what I mean? So Ad and I were just sitting here with a brother who was telling us about a land grant that his family has, and he's telling this crazy story about all kinds of things. And I'm taking it in, and then he said, yeah, same thing happened to me. When I was dealing with somebody who passed away in my family, Allah grant them peace. And to think about in those moments where there's money and there's wealth and there's all this other stuff, Imam Bukhari puts this hadith in that chapter that tells you, hey man, the halal is clear and the haram is clear. And where there's doubts in the middle, it's better to maintain your religion and your honor to leave the doubtful things. You get what I mean? You want to be able to start reflecting on these things too. So you're not just looking at it in a vacuum, but seeing how did people see this and where was its applicability to them. Do you know? This young boy, Nu'man ibn Bashir, is hearing this at a young age. And some of us probably will hear this also at some capacity as we are navigating our relationship with religion. But here now the Prophet adds in other elements to it. He gets to a place where he gives this illustration of the shepherd taking the sheep to graze. And then at the end he talks about what is a very important part of the hadith. The entire hadith is important, but the end part is extremely important. He talks about the heart and the nature of the heart and how these things relate to each other. So we're going to take a pause here, and we'll pick up on the latter part of the hadith next Monday. And likely what we'll do is go till around this time, 7:15, 7:30, so 6 to that time. And then from 7:15 or 7:30 for an hour, we're going to do kind of a Islam 101 class. It'll either be on Monday or Tuesday night. We didn't decide yet, but probably on Monday nights. So I had done one in the summer where we went through the fiqh of prayer. There's a lot of people who were new Muslims or exploring Islam, but also people who were Muslims for years, and they were just taking the class so that they could rebuild a relationship. And a lot of people came to me and said, I didn't know any of these things, And it helps as you're maneuvering, to know what these things mean concretely in your day-to-day so that you're not creating more difficulty for yourself. We'll likely focus on Ramadan-related topics in that, fiqh of fasting and other stuff too, because Ramadan is in just, less than 2 months. May Allah bless us in this month of Rajab and the coming month of Sha'ban, enable us to reach the month of Ramadan. And then there's some other things we're going to add on also, some kind of afternoon lunchtime events, some regular programs, probably in the coming weeks, but definitely after Ramadan, into the summer, we're going to add on a lot of book kind of reading groups for different segments, so community wide, but also like a women's reading group, for our Latino community, reading club that is oriented towards understanding like Black experience within the development of Islam, various segments that will engage. So as a community, we start reading together, and then we're gonna interject also like a Quranic reading circle. That's not just the Arabic of it, but just reading the translation, right? There's a difference between tafsir, which is like a academic scholarly science. You're extrapolating meaning from text, and what's called tadabbur, that you reflect on a text. When you do tadabbur and you reflect on a text, you're reflecting on the Quran and what does it mean to me. So we want to get back into a place where now, after we've kind of gone through some stuff with COVID, etc., regulations are kind of back to normalcy, we want to build a relationship with our book and learn from each other and reflect together. So we'll have some circles where we're just like reading, like from page 1, the verses together and hearing from each other and reflecting together on them. Why I'm sharing this with you all is they're not going to all just start next week, but over the course of the coming months, you want to make time for these things. One, so we can benefit from your insights, and two, so that as a community, we're also benefiting from these like amazing things that Allah has given to us, right? Unlocking the Quran and making it a central anchor in your life is just going to be a source of light and benefit, inshallah. Do you know what I mean? And if you have like a day that goes without reading Quran, it's a day that you've missed like an opportunity for real increase in benefit. It doesn't have to be pages and pages of it, but just engage in some aspect of reflection. It's easier sometimes when you have a buddy to do that with. Do you know what I mean? So all of that will be put out on the email list. We're waiting for our students who came back today, most of them. Some started a week ago. Some started like right after New Year's in our med school, dental school, etc. Our law school started last week. Make special dua for them. Allah put barakah in their studies and grant them tawfiq in all of their efforts. But we'll have like a welcome dinner for them on Wednesday where we'll share a lot of these things and then give them a cycle to like sign up for next week. So just kind of keep that in mind. And all the other halakas we do are going to be happening also. If you are a student, undergrad or grad, on Wednesday at 5:30, we're going to have a welcome back dinner that you should definitely come to. It's going to be in the building next door, the Kimmel Center. Friday is going to be, we're going to have a community lunch after. I don't think we're doing fried chicken Friday. There's a new Palestinian restaurant that opened in the Bronx that's delivery only. So we're going to have them cater just as a way to kind of like raise awareness. We'll share like their information so that you all can like tell people to order from them also. And then Saturday, we have an all-day conference taking place here. Sheikh Suhaib Webb's going to be here, Sheikh Mikhail Smith, Sheikh Yasser Birjas, and others. We're doing it in conjunction with Mass New York. And it's going to be a really great set of discussions. You should definitely come out for it if you can. And it's not just for like, it's called like Mass Youth, but that's just their name of their thing. Do you know what I mean? There's a Mass Youth Center in Brooklyn, for example, right? But it's not just for like, I think the age restriction is actually 16 and up. So it's not like for younger kids, it's for like everybody, for all of us. So try to come, encourage people to come. I think we've got like a few hundred tickets for it already out. And it's not going to be like one of the last conferences we did. If you remember the Miftah conference we did in October, if people came to it, we were seated on the ground. This one, they wanted everybody in chairs. So we're only going to have about 400 people, I think, at most, in the room. So don't wait till the last minute. We're not going to like not let people in, but and if people can't afford the ticket price, when we have these events where there's a charge, it's usually the outside organization that's charging for it. But just let us know, if it's something you can't afford. That shouldn't be like a barrier to entry. And you can just let me know, but let your friends know also. And if you get circulated amongst people, that would be great as well. Okay, was there anything I was forgetting? Noor has these postcards in the back that we've been having people sign from. Yeah. Yeah, so this is an action that we've been doing for our brothers and sisters in Gaza. May Allah grant them ease and end the occupation there. If you take 2 minutes to sign it, that would be great. So just really quick, so that the last thing we did is not you hearing from me. If you just turn to the people next to you for 2 minutes, what are some of the things you're taking away from tonight's conversation? Then we'll come back and we'll call the adhan for Isha. But just really quickly, so you guys end with a little bit more concreteness, some of the things you're taking away, and then we'll wrap up to pray. But go ahead. You can turn it off. Yeah.